let's start Putin's visit to India. What do you think he achieved?
Well, there was a lot of expectations that that there would be enormous defense deals and things of that kind, but that didn't happen.
There.
And here I suspect the Indians were a bit nervous because these defense deals are in the pipeline, but I think that they don't want to simply do that at a time when the US has been threatening them with more tariffs. So the pomp and the circumstance and the ceremonies and all of that were all about other things, and they didn't want to emphasize the military dimension. What Putin achieved, in my opinion, is in the long term much more important, which is that he got India to commit more deeply to BRICS. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about India being a kind of semi-detached or skeptical partner within BRICS. What the Russians want is India, obviously, to remain part of BRICS. They want to develop a very strong economic relationship with India. And the Russians have a lot of technology that they can provide to India, and they've had experience of providing India with industrial goods and things of that kind. And at the same time, they want to become a major market for Indian goods, like consumer goods, but also perhaps some items of industrial goods, and things of that kind. And there's also some talk, about increasing amount of talk in Russia, that Russia suffers from a labor shortage and that Indian workers could come to Russia to work there. So all of those things. But ultimately, the major priority for the Russians is to bind BRICS closer together. And they want, therefore, to see India fully commit to BRICS and not think that it has any, alternatives, or think about American alternatives. And Russia is in a strong position to do that because it has this very long, very strong relationship with India. The Indians have very, very warm feelings about Russia. The Russians have very warm feelings about India. So consolidating this relationship binds together the BRICS.
I do think Modi is in a pretty hard, tough situation. He's trying to strike this balance between the United States and Russia, which is not very easy. And then, of course, at the background, there's also China, and then he's in this conflict with Pakistan. It's not very easy for him to strike all these balance, isn't it?
No, it is absolutely not. I mean, it should be pointed out that the US-Indian relationship is relatively new. It goes back to the time of George W. Bush. Until that time, India and the US had generally had a very tense relationship with each other. But George W. Bush, who was the first president to be straightforwardly hostile to China, though not to the extent that we see now, he began the policy of building up India as a counter to China. And of course, the Indians up to that point had relied on the very strong relationship they had with the other superpower, which was the Soviet Union. And India wanted to balance its relations. It wanted a superpower ally. It always wants a superpower ally because, to say straightforwardly, it was defeated in a war by China in 1962, and China has become a much, much more powerful country since then, as we all know. So for that reason, China tilted, since the Soviet Union was no longer there, it tilted towards the United States. I get the sense that relations between India and the United States have cooled significantly. And this was already the case before these latest tariffs and all of that. And I'll come to that in a moment. So India is now looking at another country which maybe not quite a superpower in the way that the Soviet Union was a superpower, but is clearly a rising power, and which is friendly, and which is Russia. So they're tilting back to the Russians again. And of course, the Russians want them to do that. And at the same time, the Russians want to guide India away from its anti-Chinese positions. That everybody understands that that's going to take a very, very long time to do. Now, one of the reasons is that India has, as we've discussed in previous problems, it is disappointed with what happened with the United States. In the Indian imagination, the reason China took off in the 1990s and 1980s and 1990s was because there was this enormous flood of American investment into China at that time. This is, and by the way, this is what many, many people believe. People in the United States believe it too. It is absolutely not the whole truth. It is only a very small part of the truth, if I can say. I mean, you read that article by Arnaud Bertrand, and in fact, China's economic achievement is something that China did. Not it wasn't a gift from the US, but the Indians thought that this flood of American investment that they imagined had gone to China would now this time come to them. And they are very, very disappointed that it hasn't happened on anything like the scale that they expected. And they discovered that the Americans aren't good at providing infrastructure and don't like to enter into technology sharing agreements and all of those things. The Russians are very good at infrastructure, not perhaps at the Chinese level, because no one is, but nonetheless, they are good at infrastructure. If you go to Russia, you see the roads, the bridges, all of that. They're very good. And the Russians share technology. And so this makes Russia a good partner for India at the present time. It's something that China should welcome, by the way, because, of course, the thing is that Russia's relationship with China is its paramount relationship. By the way, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has just confirmed this again today. He's made a speech to the upper house of the Russian parliament. So a good relationship between India and Russia makes it much less likely that there will be any conflicts between India and China in the future. And given that a lot of the Indian grievance against China is that China has prospered where India has stagnated, well, until recently stagnated. If India starts to get its act together economically and then feels confident enough to ask China to involve itself even more deeply in India and build up its railways and its roads and all of those things. I mean, India is the ideal place, by the way, for fast trains, for the super trains that China has. I mean, India needs them even more than China does, in my opinion. But anyway, if India can get over all of this, it can feel that it's not only growing fast, but its manufacturing and industries are starting to come together again, then India and China might start to establish a better, closer relationship, because the Indians might begin to regain their self-confidence and not be so stressed about a few hills in the Himalayas that they really basically don't care about. Just to say, everybody who spends any time with Indians discovers this very quickly.
So Macron visited China.
Yeah.
You were talking about he's changing, so fast. And this sure enough, so within 24 hours, he was all friendly, all that when he was in China, and then went back and immediately threatening China. He's going to, EU should impose United States-like type of tariffs. But he should know that the United States tariffs doesn't work.
No.
Right? Is he really stupid?
Well, he's absolutely stupid. I mean, China has just recorded the biggest trade surplus of any country in recorded history, $1 trillion. And that's not even for the whole year, by the way. That's for just the 11 months of the year that we've had up to now. So, I mean, this is despite all of those American tariffs. I mean, China's manufacturing prowess continues. China's exports continue. The idea that the EU is any more capable of slowing this juggernaut down is nonsense. Yeah. And all that it would do is it would devastate further the French economy, the European economy, if they were to go down this route. I mean, it would be utter folly to them. By the way, there'll be an awful lot of people in France who will not agree. I mean, where does all that French cognac go? For one thing, I mean, just to give one rather trivial example.
The thing about it is just to share with you, there are French living in China, and then they were commenting. They're saying now China showed lots of hospitality towards him, right? The people were very warm in Sichuan, and so there were French living in China saying he's not that popular in France. We all don't like him, but the Chinese people are too friendly towards him. And sure enough, he just flipped right after. So there are some people from Sichuan actually responded why he was so well received in Sichuan. They're saying that in Sichuan there are mountainous areas with a lot of wild monkeys. So they're saying, okay, and of course the panda. So they're saying, okay, he's more rare than panda, and he's more friendly than those monkeys because monkeys, they take tourist things like your hat and sometimes your phone. They're very aggressive, those kind of monkeys. So he's not as aggressive as those wild monkeys. And it's entrance. There's no entrance fee required, so it's free to watch him. So that's how people commented on why people welcome him so much.
I suspect, joking aside, that there's probably some other reason for this, which is that Macron is still able to trade on the immense goodwill France achieved under the leadership of General de Gaulle. Because de Gaulle was the first Western leader to recognize the People's Republic of China and to establish diplomatic relations with it. He always treated China as a great nation and a great country. The policy was then consolidated by his successor, Georges Pompidou. And, France, for a very, very long time, even after Pompidou's death, under subsequent presidents, positioned itself as the Western country most friendly to China. And of course, that is no longer the case. But I think, because Chinese people have a very long memories, I think some of that is still remembered in China, perhaps also amongst members of the Chinese leadership. So I suspect this is probably why, despite the fact that Macron is indeed a weird character, very weird, if I can say, very two-faced. He'll say one thing to your face and something completely different behind your back. But despite all of that, I think they still perhaps retain a residual sense that at some point relations between China and France will repair. I think they're right, by the way. I mean, I've been to France. I know France. I used to know France very, very well. And in my experience, the single most friendly country in Europe to China was France. I mean, the attitudes to China of French people were overwhelmingly positive. I mean, I believe the same is true in Italy, but I haven't been to Italy for a very long time. But I mean, in China, in France, I think there'll be an awful lot of people who don't agree at all with what President Macron is doing and saying.
Well, I just feel like he doesn't really need to do this. I mean, I guess he needs some to show he's tough on China for some European leaders. I don't know. But in terms of a front, he clearly wanted some investment from China, and China is not against invest in Europe. Look at Hungary, right? There is a factory for battery. But the problem with Europe is Europe has very unstable environment. In my view. I mean, just himself shows that. On the 1 second, okay, you are so friendly, everything's so great, and then you turn around and just saying these things. So you have that kind of attitude towards China. It's making investment hard, isn't it?
Very hard, absolutely. And I mean, you also see repeatedly that they're not just unstable, but they're not trustworthy. I mean, we've had the Nexperia debacle. Which continues. I mean, I don't get the sense that's been resolved at all. Before that, you had Huawei and what happened there. And I mean, on an entirely different front, I mean, they're now enacting emergency powers in order to confiscate Russia's assets
Yeah.
and to float a 140 billion euro loan against them. I mean, Japan, of all places, has now weighed out and said, this is wrong. Don't do it. The United States has said, don't do it. The European Central Bank has said, don't do it. But they're going to do it. It is not a safe place, as it used to be, to do business in. And because it has this extreme ideological drive, and they're becoming even worse than the Americans, which is saying something.
Yeah. And similarly, I think German also a little bit like that. Even though Germany really needs Chinese market, and there's a lot of collaborations, investment. Actually, there's a huge amount of influx of German investment into China. And then right now, the German Foreign Minister, Johann Walpole, he's visiting China. Now, he was supposed to visit China a month ago, but then he stupidly said something about Taiwan, which has nothing to do with Germany. Why would you say something like that? And so nobody in China wanted to meet him, so he had to postpone it and then kind of walk back, essentially, in order for him to come here and then come to China and prepare for, I guess, Mertz eventual visit that coming, right? Why did he do that? It's just so stupid.
Well, it is absolutely stupid because, I mean, Germany's entire industrial success over the last 20 years has been underpinned on two things: cheap gas from Russia and a very strong and very successful trade and investment partnership arrangement with China. And they've both been destroyed. And again, ideology seems to have taken over. You would have thought, given that China has no obvious points of conflict with Germany, that the Germans would want to take anti-Chinese positions. I mean, it's gratuitous and it is stupid, but that is increasingly what they're doing. Again, and I have to say this, the Germans are going where the Baltic states have led. I said this before, you know, the Russians have taken to referring to Germany as Greater Estonia. And you can see that just as the Estonians and the Baltic states are pathologically anti-Russian, the Baltic states are also pathologically and bizarrely anti-Chinese too. So Germany adopts all of that as well, and destroys itself in the process.
And there are some rumors in the Chinese media saying now that Macron was so well received, you know, with a lot of big crowds, you know, when he went to Sichuan. So now both the Mertz and the Stammer are expecting that as well. So we will see. Okay, so you just talked about that China's trade surplus exceeded 1 trillion.
Yeah.
It is unprecedented in terms of the absolute terms, 1 trillion. But actually, the big share, I think during the Song dynasty, China's export probably is in the neighborhood of a third of the world trade. And certainly in the Qing dynasty, the sea trade was about a third and going about a third trade going through Guangzhou alone. So that's not unprecedented. Right?
No, it is not unprecedented. I mean, it is unprecedented in the modern industrialized world. But then, of course, if you know about the Song dynasty, which of course is the period of China that I am most informed about because it was the one that I am most interested in. I mean, you know, I collect paintings of that time, and I know the history of the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty was on the brink of industrialization. China was at that time very, very close to industrialization in some sectors, as in porcelain manufacturing. It achieved it. The Chinese were the first people to create modern industrial lines and modern methods of industrialization. They had proper monetary policy, which nobody else did at that time. They had paper money, which was real paper money. I mean, they had absolutely proper modern, understandably modern systems of economic organization. I mean, the reason it didn't happen, and it's very simple, is because there was the invasion by the various northern people, the Liao and the Tsin, and eventually the Mongols. So I mean, it was the the external pressures that prevented this process from achieving fruition. And if you were to go anywhere in the world in around say 1000 AD, at the time of the heyday of the Sung dynasty, I mean, you just said to yourself, this place is, I mean, enormously far ahead of anywhere else. And I suspect that at that time, the Chinese economy probably accounted for a bigger share of world GDP than it does today. And probably in terms of trade, I mean, it's exactly the point that you have just made. And the same is true of the Qing dynasty as well. I mean, it was a tragedy, not just for China, but for humankind. And China was evolving in all sorts of interesting ways. I mean, it was developing its political system. The position of the Huangdi was changing. The society was becoming further away from militarism. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. The point is that you're absolutely correct. What has happened is that China has returned to its historic position within the global economy. It has always been technologically, industrially, in terms of manufacturing, extremely advanced, and it has always accounted for an enormous share of world trade.
One of the things some articles are talking about is the Chinese yuan is undervalued. The part they contribute that to the success of the export, exceeding 1 trillion, that Chinese goods are so competitive because it provides good values, right? It's good quality and low price. And that the low price comes with the undervalued yuan. At the same time, I have to say, I'm not sure the United States really want China to strengthen the Chinese yuan because, for a simple reason, because the GDP is using the current exchange rate, 1 to 7, right? Now, if the yuan strengthens, the Chinese GDP without doing anything, it will go up.
Absolutely.
Right? I don't think the US wants that.
No, absolutely. I mean, you make an absolutely excellent point. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I had a discussion with somebody about the Russian currency, which goes up and down, much more so. I mean, it goes up and down like a yo-yo, far more so than the Chinese. Well, the Chinese yuan doesn't. There's been more of a stabilization recently, but anyway, the Russians have what they call a dirty exchange rate. They do this on purpose. So because they want to maintain a trade surplus, they keep their currency going up and down, much more so than China does. But anyway, he was telling me, there's a proof that Russia's economy is contracting, and the fact that the currency is falling. And I said, there was the previous year, the Russian currency strengthened. If you use GDP, the GDP figures based on exchange rates, then that means that in that year, the Russian economy grew by 14%. Is that what you're telling me? I remember that. I remember that discussion. And needless to say, he became very angry when I said that, which is what all people always do. But you're absolutely right. If China floated its exchange rate, two things would quickly happen. Three things would happen. Firstly, the exchange rate would go up. It would strengthen. Secondly, that would mean that there would be a massive investment surge because money all around the world would flood into China. It would suck up investment from all around the world. Thirdly, the Chinese trade surplus would quickly restabilize. They would stabilize at the higher exchange rate because the exchange rate is not the big factor in the Chinese trade surplus that people imagine it is. It would not be good for China to do that because it would if you have an investment surge, you have hot money pouring into the country, that creates all kinds of volatility and instability. It would do all sorts of things. It would, in fact, be very close to what you saw happen to Japan in the 1980s. We discussed the Plaza Accord. So China is absolutely right not to do that. But it would not have the effect that many people assume it would.
Yeah.
And it's not the reason for China's tremendous export boom. I mean, this is a bad argument anyway, because it assumes that there is some technical reason for a country's enormous strength in technology, manufacturing, and industry. Technical matters are the kind of things that a government should anyway be doing in order to make economies strong. All it tells you is that the Chinese government knows what it's doing ultimately.
Okay, so let's talk about this U.S. National Security Strategy 2025, which got lots of attention. There's a huge amount of discussion in the Chinese social media and some comments from the Western mainstream media. Now, it seems like a lot of people saying that this is Trump's versions of the Monroe Doctrine and some kind of a strategic retreat. I'm not so sure. Okay, so let's walk it through a little bit. So, first of all, there is one paragraph that said this, which I'm a little bit puzzled. It says President Trump's foreign policy is pragmatic without being pragmatist, realistic without being realist, principled without being idealistic, muscular without being hawkish. Why being pragmatist and realist is a bad thing? Why do they emphasize that?
Well, you tell me. I mean, it basically, what it's basically saying, because there is a realist school of foreign policy, and which is actually pragmatic, and they're saying that that's not really what they're about at all. This is a very, very strange document, by the way. I mean, it makes some acknowledgements of the realities of the modern world. It accepts that China today is a great power and a great economy and all of that. It's very, very hostile to China. I mean, I think people understate how hostile to China this document actually, in fact, is. It clearly sees China as the great rival, and it talks about Taiwan in ways that I think people in China ought to be concerned, because it basically makes at the very least the status quo. It wants to see the status quo. In other words, this situation where Taiwan maintains a kind of, let's call it independence. I'm not talking about legal independence, but at least it's not part of the governmental system in China. Anyway, it wants to maintain that indefinitely. And ultimately, you get the sense that it would prefer that Taiwan went independent entirely. It does not want Taiwan fully reunited with the homeland. I mean, it clearly doesn't. And there's something else that it says. It says that the United States must not allow any country, and of course the only country it means is China, to become more powerful than itself. So it's setting the conditions for future conflict with China. And it talks about retrenchment. It talks about ending the forever wars. It talks about not getting bogged down in the Middle East. But what it really means is that it wants a secure American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, where, by the way, it is careful to say that external players, and again it means China, should not be allowed. It doesn't even want economic contacts between Latin American states and China. There's even a passage which talks about the importance for the United States replacing China. It is clearly China that is meant as the main economic partner of all of the Latin American states. And bear in mind, that includes Brazil. Okay. So Brazil, which is a big country, but it must be subordinate and controlled by the United States. So it wants this enormous sphere of influence, totally under America's thumb. And it wants a stabilization, as it calls it, of the situation in Europe. And that means a stabilization of the relationship with Russia. But the only reason why it wants that actually is so that it can focus on China instead. I mean, this is what this is all about. It is not, as many people say, an attempt to retreat or an attempt to pull back or to come to some kind of understanding with China. It is intended to put the United States in a stronger position so that it can pursue a very aggressive rivalry with China. I am sure that the Chinese government, who have been reading this, are not fooled about this at all.
Yeah. Well, like there are certain parts of it is pretty obvious to me. Like here it says for a country whose interests are, now the country means the United States, for a country whose interests are numerous and diverse as ours, rigid adherence to non-interventionism is not possible. To me, that means that it will continue to do regime change operations, right?
Yes.
So that's not a retreat.
No. I mean, it's even hinting now at wanting to do regime change operations in Europe. It speaks about supporting some political forces in Europe against others. Just to say, but no, you're absolutely correct. It's adjusting priorities. It accepts that the pursuit of American world domination, and it uses the word domination, interestingly, but it accepts that the pursuit of American world domination is now beyond America's reach. It doesn't use the word world domination, but it still wants the United States to remain number one, and it still sees China as a rival and an adversary. And it's absolutely prepared to use the full toolkit that the United States has perfected over the last, 80 years. Regime changes, color revolutions, internal subversion. It's absolutely prepared to use it in order to maintain control. Actually, this is a much more cynical document than what you would get from the so-called realist school. It's spheres of influence, great powers, an attempt. You could see it to play Russia off against China, to undermine China in all kinds of ways, to push it out of Latin America, for example. And ultimately with the objective that even if we can't dominate the world, we must still remain the strongest, biggest, richest country. That's I mean, it's absolutely explicit about that, by the way.
Well, it says here, we will work with allies and partners to maintain global and regional balances of power to prevent the emergence of dominant adversaries. That's pretty clear, right? It's
Absolutely.
just China cannot be adversary who, China, of course. So
there is never any suggestion of a true, genuine partnership and friendship with China. There is no hint of that in this document.
No. What it is slightly different from the previous, I guess, if you compare Trump with Biden, probably is they talked a lot about the burden sharing. So allies need to, I guess, pay the United States more to maintain the United States being the dominant power, right? So that's where it says it did make it very clear. Allies, they need to pay more. They need to contribute more.
Absolutely, because the United States, despite all the claims and bragging about how it remains the most powerful country with the best economy and the best financial system and all of that, understands perfectly well that it cannot take on China by itself. So it wants to enlist all its allies to do that for it. And by the way, we did a program about this on the Duran, Alex and I, and we discussed this at length. And this is exactly what empires that are in decline, I should stress Western colonial empires, when they are in decline, tend to do. There are two immediate examples that spring up. The first was Britain, when the British, and we discussed this at length in our program, the British, again in the 1890s and early 1900s, when they sensed that their power was ebbing, started to tell the members of the British Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that now the time had come for them to share the burden with Britain. And they also said the United States should join in and share the burden with Britain to keep the Anglo-Saxon, the English-speaking nations, at the top. And the other big example of this is the Romans. Again, going back all that way, there's a famous, to any classical historian, there's a famous letter that the emperor sent to the British cities in 400 AD as the empire was starting to weaken, in which he said that I have to, pull back the army to basically do other things. From now on, you must take on responsibility for your own defense. So empires, when they start to weaken, they start to look to their allies, and maybe one shouldn't call them allies, they're vassals, they're satellites, to take the burden off their shoulders, to lighten the burden on them.
And in terms of Asia, it's clearly stated, leading from a position of strength, meaning United States will lead, right? So continue to lead.
Yes.
So, now, one thing about Europe is kind of interesting. It says we want to support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilization, self-confidence, and the Western identity. Does it say that Europe already lost its civilizational self-confidence and the Western identity? Is that what it says?
Yes, of course it does. But you see, it's very interesting, because what they're basically saying there is that Europe is losing its self-confidence. It is losing its Western identity, which makes it less reliable as an ally of the United States. What they want them to do is to retain their Western identity so that they will continue to be allied to the United States. Loyal and effective vassals, which will treat the whole Western project, or rather the American project, as something that they have a stake in. I mean, it's very worried, if you read this, that at some point, some of the European countries, the migrant populations might outnumber the native ones, which, by the way, nonsense. I mean, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But anyway, they're worried that might one day happen, and that these states, these nations, when that happens, will cease to feel a kinship, a civilizational kinship with the US, in which case they might, horror of horrors, migrate and make friends with others, namely China. And again, that is the subtext here. This document, by the way, I mean, everybody knows this. The author is Elbridge Colby. He is the man who has mostly drafted it. And it's very clever. It's very, very cleverly written, so that it conceals many of its ideas. But you could see what he's pushing. He is pushing a very, very much rivalry and an adversarial policy towards China.
Can we say overall, my impression is this so-called Trump's version of the Monroe Doctrine is not really retreat. It's basically saying allies should contribute more to keep the United States the dominant position. And also in there's some criticism from the New York Times saying, okay, the Trump administration no longer care about the values and principles. So it does sound like that they also more practical in a way, like they drop all these in Trump's view, like nonsense to like value and all this, as long as it can counter China, whatever works. It's almost sounds like that.
It is becoming much more brutal. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine is about the Western Hemisphere. What the US is talking about, the program that is being announced here, is in a situation where all of the Latin American states, all of the American states in the northern and southern hemispheres of the Western Hemisphere become directly subordinate to the United States, like as political and economic provinces. I mean, so that their wealth and their resources are aggregated with those of the United States itself. So it's an extremely unbalanced relationship that's been proposed here, and ultimately a very, very extractive one, exploitative one. This is a much more brutal vision for South America, much more brutal vision than the actual Monroe Doctrine itself was. Yeah. I mean, it's not really anything to do with the real Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s. I mean, this is actually a neo-imperial project. That the a neo-colonial project would be the better word, with respect to the Latin Americans. And of course, they won't accept this. I mean, the idea that Brazil would agree, for example, big country, member of BRICS, one which has its own history of fighting for its independence from Portugal. The idea that they would agree to be subordinated and placed under America's thumb in this way is inconceivable. I mean, this is, it talks about realistic but not realist. This is fantastic. This is fantastical. I mean, it's nightmarish, actually. Nightmarish for the United States too.
Well, if you're saying that it's written by Elbridge Colby, I do feel the reason he written it in a little bit like cover his true intention kind of way probably is because Trump is not fully on board with him
on everything.
True. I guess. Well, one thing, for example, Trump now allowed H200. We talk about this, the high-end chips to sell to China, and I think he listened to David Sachs and some other people probably to be more pragmatic about this, realistic about this, because banning chips, high-end chips to China doesn't work. Okay, it is clear. So now he said, okay, you can buy H200. We will see if China buys it. But okay, at the same time, the most high-end, the Blackwell, is still banned. So it seems to me like even though the most advanced is still banned, but the Congress, there's still people very highly critical of him allowing this H200 to be sold to China. To me, there is two factions within the elites, within the Washington elites, that there seems like Elbridge Colby is one faction, and then Trump himself, I think, is a little bit of the other faction.
Yes, yes. I think that's absolutely correct. And I mean, there are within the industrial and commercial worlds in the United States, people who understand that this whole rivalry with China is completely wrong. Elon Musk, I think, is one such person. To say it straightforwardly, I think they understand that this is completely short-sighted and mistaken, and what they want is some kind of long-term understanding with China. And I mean, they don't want just certain types of chips to be allowed to China. I mean, they would. David Sachs, by the way, is a good friend of Elon Musk, just to say. So I mean, they want to see, they want a much more fact-based, realistic, long-term relationship with China, because they understand that is where America's true interests are, which they are, by the way. I mean, this vision that this national security strategy document outlines is not realist. It's fantastical. I mean, it is as grotesque and as absurd as the neocon vision that the Biden administration adopted of creating the so-called League of Democracies to fight the League of Autocracies, which is, I mean, that was a grotesque fantasy, but this one is almost as unreal. And one of the reasons why the language is veiled, I'm sure you're absolutely right, it is to mislead Trump, who is easily misled, and by the way has written a preface to this. But I think also it is because in America they still can't use the incredibly brutal language that would be consistent with a document like this. If you're talking about Latin America, you remember we discussed Thucydides once in the program. I mean, Thucydides once had a debate between the Athenians, one of the great empires of the time, and a vassal state of theirs, which was called Melos. And according to Thucydides, the Athenians said to the people of Melos, of the gods we believe and of men we know, that the strong do as they will and the weak do as they must. Ultimately, in terms of what the message which has been given to the people of Latin America, this is what is being said here. But, Colby can't say that simply, straightforwardly. And of course, no one in America can say it simply and straightforwardly in that way. But this is the message. Now, in the case of Athens, 15 years after the Athenians said that to the Melians, the entire Athenian empire collapsed. So, and it's a point, by the way, that Thucydides is making here. I mean, a system that is based on that kind of level of coercion is ultimately unstable. And it seems to me that this incredibly coercive and brutal system that Colby is talking about with respect to the Western Hemisphere is going to be equally unstable as well. And this entire relationship with China is fantastic too. It's unnecessary. You don't need to become this tyrant state, because that's what's being proposed here. You don't need to become a tyrant state in order to take on China. China isn't about this. I mean, it's not seeking world domination. When has China ever sought world domination? There have been periods in its history when it was so far ahead of other states. I'm talking about the Sung Dynasty, or whatever, or that notionally it might have wanted to pursue it. But the Chinese people at that time, the dynasties, the governments, when they found themselves in that position, what did they always do? They pursued policies of peace, of internal development and strengthening. Never did they seek global dominance in the way that the United States, as this paper basically acknowledges, has tried to do. And so this nightmare vision that we must be strong to prevent the Chinese becoming stronger than us and dominating us has no basis in reality at all.
The realist, the pragmatist, it seems like they always lose. It seems like.
Well, exactly.
So about this Chinese and Japanese dispute now, the latest one is the Chinese fighter jets locked the radar on the Japanese planes. Like always, the Western media doesn't report it properly. Okay, so what happened is that China was having a military training and exercising in international water. Okay, and informed Japan ahead of time, so Japan knew this, and then once China is doing that, the latest one, China actually released a recording that there was communications between the Chinese ship and the Japanese ship. Basically, China saying, we are now here conducting our military training and exercise. And Japan actually said received, meaning Japan knows this is what's going on, but yet they still fly so close to China twice. And so that's how China block the Japanese plane radar.
Yes.
Of course, the Western media doesn't report that.
No.
But what do you think Japan's trying to do? Really provoke China?
Well, I think so. And by the way, the media in London is reporting now that the Japanese government is very angry because the Trump administration hasn't given Japan as much support, and the Japanese Prime Minister as much support as it should have done in this conflict with China. And they're very angry about it, and they're complaining about it too. I had some friends of mine, or at least not friends of mine, people I know who were Japanese, and they've come back and they said that the Chinese are getting overworked up and it isn't really as bad as that. And the Japanese Prime Minister didn't mean to be as provocative as has been said. Well, I've gone back and I've read what she actually said, and it looked to me pretty provocative. I have to say, overall, I do get the sense that Japan really is looking for some kind of this government in Japan is looking for some kind of quarrel with China, and I cannot understand why. I mean, she didn't need to say anything about Taiwan at all. She was asked a question. She could have brushed it off. Shinzo Abe, who was pretty aggressive about China, knew how to do that. There's no reason why she couldn't have done. Something is happening inside Japan. Maybe they're feeling that their position is becoming increasingly unstable. Maybe they feel that their position as the leading Asian power is going, which it is, by the way, and they feel that they have to assert themselves. But they are becoming increasingly aggressive, and they're becoming increasingly reckless too.
Well, some people in the Chinese social media discussion is that Japan probably sees that US is weakening, right?
Yes.
And that maybe cause some panic for Japan because it can come to a point that China is so advanced, so powerful that even Japan, US together cannot do much to derail China's rise and that kind of thing. And so they are kind of in a hurry. And of course, it's no secret that for Japan, the best scenario is China and the US have a fight. That's no secret. Of course, Japan wants to see that.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem happening. Okay, for whatever reason, Trump doesn't really have a direct military confrontation with China. And China certainly is not looking for any direct confrontation with. But then Japan is kind of in a hurry. Okay, they have to provoke something to force the United States to get involved. It seems like that's what it is.
What you're describing is so similar to the situation in Europe that the dynamic is so similar, and it makes me, which by the way tends to support that just as the Europeans are worried that America is becoming less strong and that they might be left by themselves to deal with the Russians, and they're terrified of what that means. So they're being provocative and belligerent against the Russians beyond anything one can imagine. It's beginning to look as if Japan is going through exactly the same process. They too are worrying that America is weakening, and therefore they need to assert themselves against China and provoke China. And in both cases, the objective appears to be the same: to force the Americans to recommit in Europe against Russia, to recommit to Japan against China. Of course, that doesn't address the long-term problem. But, this is, I suppose, what these various leaders, all that they're able to think of and to imagine. Again, can I just say this? Chinese people are probably the only people in the world, now I say this seriously, who can imagine a world where the United States is not totally dominant. I mean, I as a Greek, born in Europe in the 1960s, the idea of a world not dominated by the United States remains for me completely extraordinary. The Russians, by the way, are the same. They too have been brought up that their entire world view has been constructed around the assumption of American dominance. I don't think in China that has ever existed, actually, because of China's enormous history and its backstory and the sense of confidence that came with liberation in 1949. So I think that in China, I mean, you look at these things, you look at what the Europeans are becoming, you look at what the Japanese are becoming, you look at what the Americans themselves are becoming, you see the nervousness and the wobbles that exist even in Moscow. And you say to them, why? Why are people behaving like this? And for us, and I include myself here, the change is so huge that it's unsurprising that, you know, all of these strange behaviors start to happen.
Yeah, and then not to mention Israel always want to bring in the United States, right, to fight Iran or what have you. Yeah, it seems like everybody wants to bring in the United States, you know, fully bring in the United States to get engaged, and they're in a hurry, you know. So, but honestly, in China, actually, China is totally fine with the United States continue to dominate in terms of military forces and all the, as long as it doesn't, you know, pressure China, limit China's growing space. I think China is fine with that.
Absolutely.
But
this is said so any number of times. I mean, Xi Jinping says it every time he meets American presidents. He says, "We're not here to replace you."
Yeah,
I mean, just put that idea entirely aside. We are here to develop ourselves, not to replace you. But I've said already many times that in the West we are unable to believe that. It just doesn't compute with us because we are societies whose history has always been about struggle and power and dominance. So tell someone that a country as powerful as China is not interested in those things in Europe. Tell them that this in Europe, and they just can't compute it.
No, and then the example, you know, Nexperia you just brought up, that is not totally resolved. No, in fact, their economy minister, Karremans, he gave a testimony for the parliament. The parliament really wanted to know what happened. Okay, so it's very interesting. They reviewed some things, quite a few details of what happened. First, he said that they when they made that decision, now some Dutch parliament members complained that they rushed into this decision without discussing with anybody, and it clearly is true. They obviously didn't inform the EU, and that's, I guess, some of the parliament member, like, you don't even discuss this with the EU. They certainly didn't inform their customers about this. Because he said the reason they didn't tell anybody is because they don't want China to find out ahead of time. Okay. And then he said the decision was well analyzed. They did a lot of analysis and pros and cons, and they even tried to figure out what China would do. But he admitted they didn't expect China would retaliate like this. So what
kind of analysis is that? They should sack all their analysts. Is all I can say. I mean that is incredible. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah, and then another remarkable thing is that even after China banned the chips leaving China, the government still didn't inform the parliament, apparently. It's already over the news, but nobody told the parliament this is what's going on. This is a serious situation. So some members asked him about that. And he said, well, we don't want China to move out quickly. What do you mean? China can move out anytime. By not telling your own parliament members, he's totally lost it, I feel. He's in a panic mode, I think.
Well, he's in a panic mode, but I mean, what he's describing is a story of unbelievable duplicity and hostility to China, if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, when he says that, you know, you don't want to tip the Chinese off as to what you're about to do, is that how you treat your trading partners? Is that how you treat your the people who do business in your country and who invest in it? you take these secret, oh so secret steps. I mean, to me, I wasn't aware of all of this, but all of this is astonishing.
Yeah.
And I would have thought that, anybody in China who is thinking of investing in the Netherlands now are going to say to themselves, well, after this, how can we? How can we? And the Dutch have this unbelievable arrogance that they say that they've done all this analysis and that they can't imagine that China will react. And what kind of analysis is that? I come again. I mean, they underestimate China at the very, very same time that they tell themselves and tell each other that this is aggressive and a threat to them. I mean, they can't even make up their mind about that basic thing. Anyway, I mean, frankly, they come across as blundering and incompetent and duplicitous and dishonest and hostile to China and all of those things at once.
They total disrespect of the fact that this company belongs to China. Okay,
Absolutely.
it belongs to Wintech.
Yeah.
When you sold this company to Chinese, it is a Chinese company, and China can do whatever it wants, just like a Dutch company can move in and out of anywhere they want, right? So they seems like totally forget that. It's still they owns that company. It's mind-boggling.
Absolutely.
Anyway. Before I let you go, I know your time. Just tell me the peace deal that Zelensky. There are lots of rumors that he will sign this peace deal and then he will resign by Christmas. Is that what's going on? Is that?
I don't think so. I mean, he's been making a whole series of statements over the last couple of hours, all of which suggest that he's rejecting this peace deal outright. So that he won't make any territorial concessions. He won't retreat from territory. He's demanding a treaty of alliance with the United States, ratified by the Senate, which is obviously unacceptable to the Russians. He says that yes, he's prepared to hold elections, but it is for the US to guarantee the conditions, which is basically telling the Americans come in and fight the Russians for us, and only then can we have the elections. So I don't get the sense that he's intending to go anywhere. And yes, there was a major corruption crisis, and it did target him and some of his officials. But my own sense is, again, that his European friends have rushed to his rescue. He came to this meeting in London. They all embraced and hugged him. He's gone to Rome, and the Italian Prime Minister Meloni has hugged him. They're all backing Zelensky, and I don't think he has any plans to go. Trump might want him to go, but I think for the moment, because he's got the Europeans supporting him, I think he's safe.
Okay. Can we just conclude to say that we are living in the world is more or less in a disarray because there's a lot of countries panicking at the fact that US is in decline. So whether it's the Europeans or the Japanese or Israelis, everybody wants to grab United States when the United States still is a powerful country before it's too late in their view, too late. So before that, we will continue to see some chaos. And right now, like Thailand, Cambodia, their conflict seems to resume again. So we will continue to see these kind of breakout conflicts everywhere.
You're absolutely right. Of course, they have no reason to panic. Why panic? because a country that has always been peaceful, throughout its history, is now rising. This is a cause of panic because a country has made itself, which was very, very poor, has become rich. This is a cause of panic. I mean, these are absurd things. These are the kind of fears that, well, bad children is all I can say. I mean, it's absurd. And of course, they all have their little grievances that they need to play out. So Israel wants to defeat Iran, and some of the European states want to resolve the Russian problem, and Japan has its issues. So, I mean, they're all acting in this feverish, hysterical way. But I mean, there's no foundation to it. I think, by the way, you're on to a very, very insightful point there, because I think you've got it exactly right in explaining all of these motivations. There's a famous quote by Antonio Gramsci, famous Italian communist and Marxist and theorist and all kinds of things. Anyway, he once said that in a time of transition, the cause of the crisis is that the old is dying, but the new has not yet been born.
Yeah.
And during that transition time, all sorts of morbid symptoms will appear. Isn't that exactly what we're seeing?
Yeah, lots of people are afraid of the unknown. I think that's part of that too.
Yes,
Yeah, they're afraid
yes.
what's going
Very,
on.
and as I said, for me, a world no longer dominated by the United States. I mean, I'm not afraid of it in the way that some people are, but even I find it unsettling. And I can imagine that all sorts of other people, I mean, because they're hardwired to assume that the Americans are always there, always in control, always doing things, always thinking for them. I mean, for them, I can understand why there is this subdued panic and why they're behaving now in this feverish and hysterical and reckless way. And in the middle of it, China is there, calm, stable, serene, waiting all this out.
Yeah.
It has the wisdom of a civilization that is, and of being the oldest state in continuous existence. And thank heavens for that.
Yeah, yeah. And Japan, I think in particular, is afraid because what they did during World War II. They're afraid of that. Yeah. So
of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Well, I'll let you go. So thank you so much. And we will see what happens and talk next week.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sophia. Bye.
Bye.